The conversation never stops. It runs beneath action, beneath posture, beneath the decisions you think you are making consciously. It does not shout. It does not argue. It suggests, repeats, and waits. Over time, it becomes indistinguishable from your own voice. This is where discipline collapses. Not in visible failure, but in silent permission. A small negotiation, later, not now. A quiet adjustment, just this once. No external force is needed. The body follows what the mind has already accepted. You believe you are choosing comfort. In reality, you are obeying a pattern that has been rehearsed so many times it no longer feels like a choice. A disciplined man does not eliminate this voice. He learns to recognize it before it finishes speaking. Because once the sentence completes, the action is already decided. It begins before movement. You sit still, but something has already shifted. Not in the body, nothing visible yet, but in the internal alignment that determines whether action will occur. The fracture is subtle. A single sentence forms, almost weightless, not now. It does not arrive with resistance. It arrives with agreement. This is the conversation. It does not sound like weakness. That is why it is effective. It sounds reasonable. It adjusts tone depending on the moment. When you are tired, it becomes gentle. When you are ambitious, it becomes strategic. When you are guilty, it becomes forgiving. It does not oppose discipline directly. It reroutes it. You do not notice when you begin participating. At first, you think you are evaluating options. You weigh effort against reward. You consider timing. You tell yourself you are thinking clearly. But this is not clarity. It is delay disguised as intelligence. The longer the conversation continues, the less likely action becomes. Because action requires silence. Every second spent negotiating is a step away from execution. The body remains still while the mind performs its ritual. This ritual has structure. It always follows the same sequence: suggestion, justification, permission. Once permission is granted, the body complies without resistance. This is why discipline appears inconsistent. You believe the problem is effort. You believe you need more motivation, more energy, better conditions. But effort is not the point of failure. The failure happens earlier, before effort is even required. It happens the moment you allow the conversation to continue unchecked. A disciplined man interrupts. Not after the conclusion. Not after the justification has been fully formed. He cuts the process at the first signal. The moment the tone shifts away from action, he moves. There is no counter-argument. There is no internal debate. He does not try to win the conversation. He refuses to enter it. This creates friction. The body resists sudden movement without mental preparation. It hesitates when the usual pattern is broken. There is a brief moment where nothing feels aligned. This is where most people stop. They interpret this friction as a sign they are not ready. It is the opposite. Friction is evidence that the pattern is being disrupted. The absence of smoothness is not a flaw. It is confirmation. The system is no longer operating on automatic permission. So the disciplined man moves while it feels incorrect. He stands before the mind finishes explaining why he should remain seated. He begins before the internal voice completes its sentence. He does not wait for agreement between thought and action. He forces action to lead. Over time, the conversation weakens. Not because it disappears, but because it loses authority. It speaks, but it is no longer obeyed. The tone remains persuasive, but it carries no command. The pattern breaks, and without repetition, it cannot sustain itself. This is the shift. Discipline is not built by controlling outcomes. It is built by controlling entry points. The moment the conversation begins, that is where the outcome is decided. If you allow it to proceed, you have already chosen. If you cut it immediately, the body follows a different path. There is no visible victory here. No external marker that the battle was won. Only a sequence that did not happen. A conversation that was never completed. An action that replaced it before it could take form. That is how discipline is preserved. Not through force, but through interruption. Not through intensity, but through precision. Not by overpowering the voice, but by refusing to listen long enough for it to matter. Once the conversation is allowed to continue, it begins to reshape reality. Not physically, nothing around you changes, but your perception of what matters starts to shift. Tasks lose urgency. Commitments feel flexible. Standards soften without announcement. You are still aware of what should be done, but that awareness no longer carries weight. This is the second layer of failure. The first was permission. The second is reinterpretation. You start redefining the action without noticing it. What was once non-negotiable becomes optional. What was clear becomes conditional. The mind introduces variables that did not exist before: timing, mood, efficiency, optimization. These are not tools for improvement. They are tools for escape. The conversation evolves. It no longer asks if you will act. It begins asking how you should act. It offers alternatives that appear more refined, more intelligent. You are no longer avoiding the task, you are redesigning it. This creates the illusion of control. But nothing is executed. Hours can pass inside this state. Planning replaces movement. Analysis replaces repetition. You remain mentally engaged, which makes the inactivity harder to detect. From the outside, it looks like discipline. From the inside, it feels like progress. It is neither. A disciplined man does not confuse engagement with execution. He recognizes that thought can become a form of avoidance when it is not anchored to immediate action. The longer the mind is allowed to expand the scope of the task, the less likely the body is to begin. So he reduces. Not the standard, but the entry point. He strips the task down to its most immediate form, the first physical movement required. No optimization. No restructuring. No improved version. Just the raw beginning. Because discipline does not require a perfect structure. It requires a starting point that cannot be negotiated. This is where most people hesitate again. Because reduction removes the illusion of preparation. It exposes the simplicity of action. And simplicity leaves no place to hide. When the task is reduced to its first movement, there are no more variables to adjust. Only a decision remains. Move or remain. The conversation tries to return here. It attempts to reintroduce complexity, to rebuild the space where delay can exist. It suggests improvement, refinement, better timing. It offers you a more comfortable version of the same moment. But the disciplined man does not rebuild what he just removed. He understands that complexity is the environment where discipline dissolves. So he keeps the structure minimal, almost rigid. Not because the task requires it, but because the mind exploits anything that is flexible. He moves within constraint. Same time. Same sequence. Same entry point. Repetition without negotiation. This is not about efficiency. It is about eliminating the conditions where the conversation can grow. Over time, something changes again. The mind begins to anticipate the lack of space. It still produces suggestions, but they arrive weaker, less detailed. Without room to expand, the conversation cannot fully form. It starts to collapse before it reaches permission. This is where discipline becomes visible internally. Not as motivation. Not as intensity. But as absence. The absence of negotiation. The absence of reinterpretation. The absence of unnecessary thought before action. The body begins to move with less resistance, not because it feels easier, but because there is less interference. And yet, the conversation never fully disappears. It waits for inconsistency. One deviation is enough. One moment where you allow the structure to loosen, where you entertain a suggestion longer than usual. The pattern is patient. It does not need constant success. It only needs an opening. This is why discipline cannot be treated as a temporary state. It is not something you activate when needed. It is something you maintain by closing every entry point where the conversation can begin again. Because once it starts, it does not need force to win. It only needs time. By the time you reach this stage, the conversation no longer feels like an interruption. It feels like identity. Not something separate from you, but something that is you. This is where it becomes dangerous. Because now, when the voice speaks, it does not sound like persuasion. It sounds like truth. There is no detectable shift in tone. No signal that something external has entered. The thoughts arrive clean, aligned with your personality, your preferences, your past behavior. They carry history as evidence. You've done enough for today. This is how you normally work. You perform better under pressure. These are not random excuses. They are constructed from memory. The mind uses your own patterns to justify repeating them. The conversation no longer needs to create new arguments. It recycles what has already worked. And you accept it faster. Because it matches who you believe you are. This is the third layer, identity reinforcement. You are no longer deciding whether to act. You are confirming a version of yourself. Each time you follow the conversation, you strengthen that version. Not through dramatic failure, but through quiet consistency. The pattern stabilizes. At this point, discipline does not feel difficult. It feels unnatural. Acting against the conversation creates internal resistance that goes beyond effort. It feels like contradiction. Like you are stepping outside your own structure. Most people stop here. Not because they cannot act, but because they do not want to fracture their sense of self. The discomfort is not physical. It is psychological. To move against the pattern is to reject a familiar identity. So they remain consistent, just not in the direction they intended. A disciplined man recognizes this shift. He does not try to argue with the identity. He does not attempt to rewrite it through thought. Because identity formed through repetition cannot be removed through reasoning. It must be overwritten the same way it was built. Through action that contradicts it. This is where the process becomes cold. There is no emotional alignment. No internal agreement. The action does not feel like you. It feels imposed. Mechanical. Detached. The body moves while the mind resists, and there is no attempt to reconcile the two. This is intentional. Because reconciliation is where the conversation rebuilds itself. If you wait to feel aligned, you return to negotiation. If you act without alignment, you bypass the system entirely. So he repeats. Not until it feels natural, but until the old pattern weakens. Each execution without permission creates a small fracture in the existing identity. Not visible at first. Not dramatic. But cumulative. Over time, the direction shifts. The conversation begins to change its language. It still references the past, but the past is no longer consistent. It starts to lose certainty. The statements become less definitive. Less absolute. Because the evidence is no longer clean. You have introduced contradiction. This is how identity is reshaped, not through belief, but through repeated violation of the previous pattern. The mind adapts to what is executed, not what is intended. It adjusts its narrative to match behavior, not the other way around. But this stage requires precision. If you act inconsistently, the identity does not shift. It fragments. You create multiple versions of yourself, each activated under different conditions. This weakens discipline further, because now the conversation has more material to work with. It can select whichever version supports delay. So the disciplined man does not rely on intensity. He relies on consistency under resistance. The same action, executed without agreement, repeated enough times that the mind is forced to update its model. Eventually, the conversation changes position. It no longer leads. It follows. But it never disappears. At this point, the conversation adapts to your resistance. It no longer tries to stop you at the beginning. That entry point is no longer reliable. You've disrupted it too many times. So it shifts position. It waits. You begin the task. You move without hesitation. The first actions are executed cleanly, without interruption. This creates a false sense of control. You believe the pattern has been broken. It hasn't. It has repositioned. Now it enters later. Not at the start, but in the middle, when repetition sets in, when the action becomes predictable, when attention begins to narrow. This is where the conversation regains access. Not through refusal, but through modification. Slow down. This is enough for now. You can finish the rest later. The tone is different here. Less persuasive, more suggestive. It does not try to stop movement entirely. It tries to reduce intensity, to shorten duration, to introduce small deviations that appear harmless. This is the fourth layer, degradation. You are no longer avoiding the task. You are performing it at a lower standard. Slightly less precise. Slightly less focused. Slightly shorter than intended. Nothing that feels like failure. Everything that feels acceptable. This is how discipline erodes while appearing intact. From the outside, nothing is wrong. The task is being done. Progress is visible. But internally, the structure is weakening. Because discipline is not defined by participation. It is defined by adherence to standard. And the standard is being negotiated again. A disciplined man recognizes this shift immediately. Not through emotion, but through deviation. The moment the execution drifts from its original form, he treats it as a breach. Not a minor adjustment. Not a natural fluctuation. A breach. And he corrects without delay. Not gradually. Not over time. Immediately. He resets posture. Restores pace. Reestablishes the exact standard that was defined before the action began. There is no tolerance window. No close enough. Because tolerance is where degradation compounds. The conversation resists this. It attempts to justify the adjustment. It introduces context, fatigue, time constraints, diminishing returns. It reframes the deviation as reasonable, even intelligent. It tells you that strictness is unnecessary. But the disciplined man does not reevaluate mid-execution. Evaluation happens before or after, never during. Because during execution, the mind is compromised. It is influenced by fatigue, by discomfort, by the desire to reduce effort. Any adjustment made in this state will trend toward ease, not accuracy. So he follows the original command exactly. Even when it feels excessive. Even when it feels inefficient. Even when it feels unnecessary. Because the goal is not optimization. The goal is preservation of standard. This creates pressure. Not external pressure, but internal compression. The body wants to release tension. The mind wants to reduce load. But the structure does not allow it. The action continues at the same level, without variation. This is where most people break. Not at the beginning, but here, where continuation requires sustained precision. Where the absence of negotiation becomes exhausting. Where the conversation offers relief that feels earned. But relief at this stage is not recovery. It is regression. Because once you accept reduced standards, the baseline shifts. The next time you begin, you start from a lower position. The conversation has moved the line, and you did not resist it. So the disciplined man finishes exactly as he started. Same pace. Same structure. Same intensity. No tapering. No soft ending. The final repetition matches the first. Not because it is comfortable, but because it is controlled. When the task ends, the conversation returns to silence. Not defeated. Not removed. Just waiting. After the task ends, there is a brief window. No movement. No demand. No immediate pressure to act again. This is where most people lower their guard. They interpret completion as release. A moment to relax, to drift, to step out of structure. This is where the conversation returns in its quietest form. Not to stop you. Not to reduce your standard. But to reshape what happens after discipline has already been executed. You've earned a break. Take it easy now. Reset for later. It sounds harmless. It sounds deserved. This is the fifth layer, aftermath conditioning. What you do immediately after execution determines whether discipline compounds or dissolves. But the mind does not frame it this way. It frames it as recovery, as balance, as necessary compensation for effort. And you follow it without resistance. You reach for distraction. You allow posture to collapse. You shift into a different mental state entirely, unstructured, reactive, passive. It feels like relief, but it is not neutral. It is directional. Because state transitions are not isolated. The way you exit discipline affects how you enter it next time. If the exit is loose, the next entry becomes harder. If the exit is controlled, the next entry remains accessible. But most people do not control the exit. They treat discipline as a contained event, something that begins and ends with the task itself. They ignore the transition that follows. And this is where the pattern regains strength. Because the conversation is rebuilding. It uses the relaxed state to reintroduce softness, to normalize lack of structure, to remind the body what ease feels like. Not as a reward, but as a contrast. So that the next time discipline is required, resistance feels stronger. A disciplined man does not collapse after execution. He transitions with intent. Not into another task immediately, but into a controlled state. The body remains upright. The breathing stays steady. The environment does not change abruptly. There is no sudden shift into comfort. He holds the line a little longer than necessary. This is not about denying rest. It is about defining it. Rest is structured, deliberate, contained. It has boundaries. It does not bleed into distraction. It does not erase the state that was just established. It preserves it at a lower intensity. This changes the pattern. The mind expects a drop. When it does not receive it, it cannot fully reset the previous structure. The contrast between discipline and rest becomes smaller. The transition becomes smoother. The next entry point remains intact. Over time, recovery stops being a vulnerability. It becomes part of the system. The conversation still attempts to intervene here. It suggests extending the break, loosening the structure. It introduces small shifts that seem insignificant. But these shifts accumulate. They redefine what normal feels like. And normal is what you return to without thinking. So the disciplined man controls what normal becomes. Not through intensity, but through consistency across transitions. He does not allow sharp drops or uncontrolled drift. Every phase, entry, execution, and exit, is held within the same framework. Because he understands something most ignore. Discipline is not just how you act. It is how you continue after action ends. At this stage, the conversation becomes less visible, but more embedded. It no longer announces itself through clear sentences. There is no distinct voice, no identifiable suggestion. Instead, it manifests as subtle shifts in behavior, micro-adjustments that seem automatic. You do not hear it. You enact it. This is the sixth layer, automation. The body begins to move in ways that reflect the old pattern, even when the conscious mind is aligned with discipline. You sit slightly longer than intended. You reach for distraction without a clear reason. You delay by seconds, not minutes. Each action is small enough to avoid detection. But they accumulate. Because discipline does not break in a single moment. It fragments across dozens of unnoticed deviations. Each one too minor to correct. Each one reinforcing the underlying pattern without triggering resistance. You believe you are still in control. Because there is no obvious failure. But control has shifted. The system is now running beneath awareness. The conversation no longer needs your attention. It has been encoded into timing, into posture, into default responses. You act before you think, and the action follows the old structure. This is where most attempts to rebuild discipline fail. Because you cannot interrupt what you cannot detect. A disciplined man adapts here. He stops relying on awareness alone. Awareness is too slow for this layer. By the time you notice the deviation, it has already occurred. Correction becomes reactive instead of preventive. So he installs constraints. External, fixed, non-negotiable constraints that operate independently of his internal state. Time locks. Environmental controls. Predefined sequences that remove decision points entirely. Not to simplify the task, but to eliminate variability. Because variability is where automation hides. When the structure is flexible, the body fills the gaps with default behavior. When the structure is rigid, there are no gaps to fill. The action becomes binary, executed or not. No middle ground. No subtle deviation. This creates a different kind of pressure. Not mental, but structural. The environment itself enforces discipline. The sequence does not allow drift. The timing does not adjust. The conditions do not respond to mood. You either align with it, or you stop completely. And stopping becomes visible. This is the key. The sixth layer survives on invisibility. It requires that deviations go unnoticed. Once they are exposed, once the system makes them obvious, they lose their ability to operate silently. So the disciplined man makes deviation obvious. He defines exact start times, exact durations, exact endpoints. He removes ambiguity from the process. Not to increase efficiency, but to expose inconsistency the moment it appears. If the action starts late, it is visible. If it ends early, it is visible. If the sequence breaks, it is visible. There is no interpretation. Only alignment or misalignment. This forces a shift. The body can no longer rely on automatic behavior without consequence. Each deviation is immediately confronted, not through emotion, but through structure. There is no need to analyze why it happened. The system does not care. It only registers that it did. And resets. Over time, the automation begins to change direction. The same mechanism that once supported indiscipline starts to support discipline instead. The body begins to default toward execution, not delay. The timing becomes consistent. The sequence stabilizes. But this does not mean the conversation is gone. It has simply been contained. And containment requires maintenance. Because if the constraints loosen, even slightly, the automation will revert. Not gradually, but immediately. The old pattern is still present. It does not need to rebuild. It only needs access. So the disciplined man does not remove the structure once it works. He keeps it in place. Not as a temporary tool, but as a permanent boundary. Because at this level, discipline is no longer something you choose. It is something the system enforces. By now, the conversation has lost its form entirely. There are no words left to intercept. No tone to recognize. No argument to cut off. What remains is a field, an internal atmosphere that shapes behavior without ever presenting itself directly. This is the seventh layer, environmental control from within. You wake, and before any clear thought appears, a direction has already been set. Not consciously chosen, not verbally expressed. Just a quiet leaning. Toward delay. Toward ease. Toward the path that requires the least immediate resistance. Nothing announces it. And that is why it is effective. Because you move inside it without questioning it. The same way you adjust to temperature without noticing. The same way posture shifts without command. It is constant, and because it is constant, it becomes invisible. This is where discipline is no longer a matter of interruption. There is nothing to interrupt. The system has extended beyond moments and into baseline. It defines the default state you return to between actions. And if that baseline is misaligned, every action that follows will require force to correct it. Force is not sustainable. So the disciplined man does not fight the environment. He replaces it. Not partially. Not gradually. Completely. He reconstructs the internal baseline through external consistency so rigid that it leaves no room for drift. Wake time does not move. First action does not change. Sequence does not adapt. The day begins the same way, regardless of condition. Not because it is optimal. Because it is fixed. This begins to overwrite the internal atmosphere. The body starts to expect the sequence before the mind has time to interpret it. Movement occurs without evaluation. Not automatic in the old sense, but pre-committed. The decision was made long before the moment arrived. This is the inversion. Instead of reacting to the internal environment, the structure defines it. The baseline shifts from passive to directed. Not through awareness, but through repetition that leaves no gaps. But this level introduces a different risk. Rigidity without awareness can become mechanical decay. If the structure is followed without precision, it degrades silently, just like before. The actions remain, but the standard slips. The form exists, but the discipline does not. So the disciplined man embeds checks within the structure. Not reflective checks. Not emotional ones. Physical confirmations. Exact repetitions. Measurable outputs. Each action has a clear standard that cannot be approximated. You either match it, or you don't. There is no interpretation layer. This keeps the structure alive. Because at this level, survival of discipline depends on accuracy, not intention. The system must not only run, it must run correctly. Every deviation, no matter how small, is corrected immediately. Not discussed. Not postponed. Corrected. Over time, the internal environment stabilizes. Not as silence, but as alignment. The quiet leaning that once pulled toward ease begins to shift. The default direction changes. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but enough that resistance no longer defines the starting point. Action does not feel easier. It feels expected. And expectation removes friction before it forms. But even here, the conversation is not gone. It exists at the edge. Waiting for disruption. For inconsistency. For a break in the structure large enough to reintroduce variability. It does not need much. A single day without precision. A single sequence left incomplete. That is enough. So the disciplined man does not trust the system simply because it works. He maintains it because it can fail. Every day. Without warning, nothing about this ends. There is no point where the conversation disappears completely. No stage where you are free from it. What changes is not its existence, but your position relative to it. At the beginning, it leads. Then it negotiates. Then it hides. Then it becomes structure. And if you are not precise, it takes control again without warning. This is why discipline cannot be treated as something you build and keep. It is something you enforce continuously. Not with intensity, Not with motivation, but with structure that does not loosen when you feel stable. Because stability is where failure re-enters. The moment you believe the system is secure, you stop watching the entry points. You allow small deviations. You permit slight adjustments. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. But that is enough. The conversation does not need force to return. It only needs access. And access is created through carelessness. So the disciplined man does not relax his standards when things are working. He becomes more exact, more controlled, more aware of transitions, of timing, of sequence. Not out of fear. Out of understanding. Because he knows the truth most avoid. Discipline is not maintained by strength. It is maintained by eliminating the conditions where weakness can operate. He does not silence the conversation. He outstructures it. And that is the only reason it no longer decides for him.